We're continuing our conversation on behalf of the Rotary Club of Knoxville. I want to thank you for listening in. I have my good friend and fellow Rotarian, Bob Potter, who is going to be our person today that we're going to be talking with. Bob, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Beautiful day outside.
It is a beautiful April day.
It is beautiful. And I enjoy seeing all the different colors of the flowers, trees and shrubs and such. It's a beautiful time.
We've been waiting a long time during this cold winter. Let's talk about what Bob Potter was doing, where he was at around 1940.
Okay. 1940, I was in junior high school. 1945, I was a senior in high school in the small coal mining town of Summit Hill in eastern Pennsylvania. Population about 5,000, still about the same thing. There wasn't much going on in town. My mother was a dressmaker, and I peddled newspapers and trained beagle hounds for my neighbor. So along about November of 1944, an Army guy came to our high school and told us about a program called ASTRP, Armed Services Training Reserve Program, which was designed at that time for 17-year-olds. And if we agreed, they gave us an academic exam heavy on mathematics and physics and that sort of thing. And I happened to pass, surprisingly. And shortly after that, I was sent to Pennsylvania Military College in Chester, Pennsylvania. And the courses there were very similar to our high school courses, but more intense. And I remained there until the end of April. The war in Germany terminated that program. So unexpectedly, I got home in time for high school graduation. And then on June the 2nd, I enlisted in the Navy. And at that time, the Navy had a program they called the Minority Cruise. If you enlisted before you were 18, then they terminated you the day you became 21, which was a good program. And so anyway, I enlisted, and I went to boot camp in Bainbridge, Maryland. And typically spent most of my time with the rest of the group, which was a pretty large group at that time. And our activities in turn included learning how to walk or to march, and learning how to take commands and give commands, and recognize the different flags and that sort of thing. And let's see, that was in June. And I brought a note with me because if you don't mind, I'll refer to it from time to time. In November of 1945, I was sent out to San Diego, California, and assigned to a landing ship medium, LSM 391, which was a relatively small one of the smaller ocean-going ships. It was about 300 feet long and had a crew of about 30, 40 people. And I was a radar operator at the time. I had gone to school at Point Loma in San Diego for about 2 months training. And I didn't learn to repair radar, but I learned to operate it and to track relative motion, which was handy because later on I got involved, much later on, I got involved in what they called hunter-killer exercises. Anyway, in the meantime, I was on, let's see, 2 more LSTs, landing ship tanks, same thing as a radar operator, and then finally on an LCI, a landing craft infantry, which was the smallest, the Navy's smallest ocean-going vehicle. And during the time that I was on these amphibious craft, I spent about almost 2 years in North China. The US government at that time had a program with Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist army, which later, of course, was defeated by the Communist Army. But our program was to take aboard the ship a Chinese crew numbering about 30, 35, and each of us was matched up with one Chinese fellow, a young man. They couldn't speak English, we couldn't speak Chinese, but it's amazing how much could be communicated by show and tell and eye contact and the use of hands. Anyway, they lived with us and went through all the motions we went through, and then at the conclusion of a 3-month training period, we took a training cruise, went from Qingdao, North China, down to Shanghai, and then across the Formosa Straits to Formosa, and then from there northward to Incheon, Korea. And at Incheon, I happened to be in Seoul, Korea for Christmas of '45. And Seoul was, Korea's cold. That's all I can remember about it.
Where were you when the atomic bomb was dropped?
That comes a little bit later, yeah. After my duty on the landing craft, I was sent back to the States in December of '47 for home leave and had a 1-month leave. Then I was reassigned to Subgroup 3 in San Diego, California. And there I was put aboard the USS Buckley, which was a radar destroyer, radar picket destroyer. And I was served about 3 months on that ship, and then was assigned to the USS Davidson, a minesweeper. And on both of those ships, we participated in the hunter-killer exercises, in which there would be 3 ships, surface ships, 3 submarines, and 3 airplanes. And they would be all moving around, and the idea was for the submarines and the airplanes to attack our ship. And my job as radarman was to keep a relative motion chart on which each of these vehicles was identified, and I had to track them as they moved and then inform our captain on the bridge so that he could take countermeasure movements. And it was during that time, I think on the Buckley, that we were in the area of Kwajalein and Eniwetok in South Pacific, where the second ABRAM test was done. But we were about 400 miles from the actual bomb site, and we had scientists aboard who were putting up balloons and getting information, that sort of thing. Finally, in March of 1948, we headed back to San Diego, and on August the 19th of 1948, exactly 3 years after I enlisted, I was discharged. And so I spent some time in San Diego looking around for a ride back to Pennsylvania, and found a guy who was heading that way, and he had a Ford coupe, of which he was very, very proud. And on the way back to Pennsylvania, I think it was somewhere in Nebraska, we had an accident. We were on the main highway, and another car pulled out, a big car driven by a lady, an older lady, pulled out onto the highway, and we hit it. And of course, that pushed in the whole front end of our car.
How long did it take you to get across the country?
At that time, about a week. Later on, 3 or 4 different times, I hitchhiked across the country in less time. But then I was as I say, I was retired from the Navy in August 1948. And the last ship that I was on, I used to stand mid-watches from 12 midnight to 4 a.m. And at that time, a young Navy officer, an ensign from the ROTC program, was assigned to our ship, and he was assigned to the communications division. So he and I stood watches, mid-watches together. And it was a nice guy, very nice guy. And during the mid-watch, there isn't an awful lot to do. So he would question me. He said, "What are you going to do when you get out?" And I honestly did not know. And so he listed a lot of different subjects. And he said, "What do you think you'd be interested in?" And so I told him that as a young man in high school, I had spent most of my time training beagle hounds to hunt and to run in field trials. And I managed these hounds in field trials. So I thought something outdoors would be appropriate. So he had a couple of college catalogs. He was a graduate of the University of West Virginia, and he drug out his catalog, and we went through it page by page until we found a curriculum that we thought I might be able to make it in. And we settled on forestry. So with his help, and I wanted to go back very much to the West Coast, to the Rocky Mountain areas, which I liked. And with his help, we wrote letters to the University of California, University of Idaho, University of Montana, University of Oregon, and we were rejected on all of them because at that time, they were required by their state laws to give first priorities to veterans from their state. So as a last resort, we wrote to Penn State. 2 weeks later, I was
You were accepted.
I was on the forestry campus at Mont Alto, a little town in southern Pennsylvania, studying forestry. And then, during the 4-year curriculum in forestry, during the summer times, I would work out west, hitchhike out, and work for the Forest Service. And the first summer, I worked on a trail crew with saw and axe, clearing trails of logs that were knocked down during the winter time, and 2 months on a lookout tower, which I learned to cook. But in preparation of going on the lookout tower, I had purchased up quite a lot of food, including about 2 pounds of roast beef. And I ate roast beef for 2 months. And I got sick and tired of roast beef. Anyway, I hitchhiked back to the States at the end of the summer and resumed curriculum at Penn State. Then the next summer, I was obliged to go to Penn State's forestry camp in northern Pennsylvania. And finally, in the last summer, that was the summer of 1951, I worked with the smoke jumpers for the Forest Service and was assigned to Missoula, Montana, where we learned to parachute and operate radios and first aid and all sorts of things. Then we, at completion of 1 week of training, we signed up on a jumper list. And as forest fires occurred in the wilderness areas of the Northwest and the Rocky Mountains, smoke jumpers were assigned to these fires because it would take, we could jump in 1 hour on fires that would take ground crews 2 or 3 days to get to by horseback or walking. Mm-hmm. And that was a wonderful experience. But I think you were interested mainly in military experience. So I'll quit there unless you have questions.
Well, we're gonna go back because I know that after that experience, you became a world traveler, and I want to talk about that towards the end. Going back to World War II, do you remember when the bomb was dropped?
Yes, only because it was announced over the ship, and in the far distance horizon, we could see smoke.
So you could see the flume.
A little bit, yeah, but that was about all.
What is your opinion of our country's decision to drop that bomb?
I had no qualms at all about that. That was all a part of the war. And basically the war was, there was one set of countries armed and fighting against another set of countries, and more power to the winner. And so bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all of the destruction and death that included really did not bother me. I never thought about it much, except that it was a way home.
So, in your experience, you did not see combat.
No, I was very, very lucky. I was enlisted during that time that I qualified for the GI Bill of Rights, which later gave me many benefits, including college and the down payment for a new house after I'd married. But I had never had to shoot at anyone, and I was never shot at by anyone, so far as I know. So I was lucky.
But your participation in the military surpassed the end of World War II. You were in it for about 3 years after the war.
Yes, yes.
Did you enjoy your experience?
Yes, to me it was a wonderful adventure. But of course at that time, for a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old, anything away from the coal mining area of Pennsylvania was an adventure. And I enjoyed the travel and the assignments and the training and the meeting with different people. Yeah, I can honestly say that the military experience that I had was positive, not negative.
Did you have any friends that died in the war that you knew?
Yes. I had inherited a newspaper route from a young man in my hometown called Bill Rameli. And he was assigned as a radio operator to a submarine, which was later sunk, and of course Bill died. And that left quite an impact on me. And then later, one of the guys that we hunted with, I forget his name, had been on Iwo Jima with the Marines. So he had a lot of horror stories to tell. And as I say, being young and anxious to learn about adventure, all of these stories had an impact on my thinking. So I never resisted moving from one place to another or getting involved in new and different activities. And again, that later helped me when I was in the Forest Service.
Did you hate the Japanese at that point in your life?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, later on, I worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and I spent 3 years in their headquarters office in Rome. And my colleagues at that time included a German, an Italian, a Japanese, and I don't know, an Italian and several other nationalities. And so far as I was concerned, these were good guys. They helped me, I helped them. We worked together. And I think that was one of the advantages of being born and raised in the United States of America, that unlike people in many other countries, including Germany and Japan, were instilled at an early age with hate toward their enemies. And that sense of hate stayed with them. But that was not true in the United States that I experienced. As I say, we had guys, a lot of guys in the military, and they were all glad to get home and to their families. And their object was to kind of quickly forget the bad experiences they had overseas. and to get re-involved with their family and in their community, and to do the things that they enjoy doing, hunting, fishing, golf, so on.
Well, let's go to, honestly, what I think is the real interesting aspect of your life, and that is after the war, you went into forestry, and you found yourself in Rome, South Africa, Swahili land.
Well, about 40 different countries. First of all, I worked in the Forest Service for about 3.5 years on national forests. And then during the last year of my time in the Navy, in the Army, in the Forest Service, I was assigned to the Washington office in international training. And at that time, it was a program of the United States to invite foresters from other countries to the United States to learn about our management of national forests and our progress in genetics, developing better species of trees, and in improving planting methods and so on, and firefighting. And so I enjoyed that experience. And then after about 3 years of that, I was assigned, well, no, let's see, I was discharged because by that time I had 35 years government service. And I was discharged and I was employed by the Food and Agriculture Organization. And I spent 3 years in Rome working, as I indicated. And the main part of that job was meeting with these foresters from other countries and helping them to develop training programs in the U.S. So I would arrange with them in developing what their training priorities were and where in the U.S. they should be assigned, and then making arrangements with the various state foresters and the various colleges and universities to accept these guys and give them the training they needed. And then after about maybe a year or two of this, I got a letter one day from a German, Horst Golding, a young German. He had been a fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe, and he was a feisty little son of a gun. And he was being assigned to Pakistan. And he said, got a letter from him, said, "Are you interested?" And of course I was interested. And fortunately, I was married to a girl, Phyllis, and she was interested in traveling too and new experiences. So she never had any objection to our foreign assignments. So we went to Peshawar, Pakistan, in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. And at that time, the country was ruled by Bhutto, who was quite liberal in his policies. His daughters, for example, had received college education in the United States, and they could speak English, and they were very liberal compared with conservative Muslim culture in northwestern Pakistan. And after our project in Peshawar and in the Northwest Province was to identify potential forestry projects that had potential commercial value, because Bhutto was interested in improving the armaments of Pakistan, because at that time hostilities between India and Pakistan were at a peak. And the only way that Pakistan could get modern armaments was on world markets. And they had to have hard currency to do that, either US dollars, German marks, or English pounds. So he had in mind for us to search out and map out different commercial forest areas in which timber cutting could take effect, and he could sell the timber for hard currency. And after a while, he began to develop some internal resistance from the conservative Muslims and the military. You may remember he was succeeded by General Kia, and the army at that time in Pakistan was very conservative. So Bhutto was ousted and jailed and evicted from the country and eventually hung. And about that time, my German friend, Horst Gorting, had been reassigned to a little country in southern Africa called Lesotho, Lesotho. It used to be called Basuto land, and it was in the northeast corner of the Republic of South Africa. It was high country, about 11,000 feet, high and dry, and it was called treeless country, mainly because the culture of the Sotho people had been to have animals, mainly cows and goats, which they allowed to graze anywhere. And eventually, they grazed everything, including tree seedlings and everything else. And it was the custom at that time in Lesotho to have these animals not for meat, but for, I forget what you call it, but for the young men to give their potential wives to marry them. And so they had these animals, and they made, those who owned them were interested only in one thing, breeding more and more animals. And they didn't care where they grazed or what they did. So my project assigned in Lesotho was to establish a village tree planting project. And Lesotho did not have enough money to buy tree seed from other countries. So the only way we could get regenerative material, there were three main river basins in Lesotho running north and south. And by walking out these river basins, we discovered that there were small vegetation still alive, but they could be regenerated from root cuttings and stem cuttings. In other words, you cut the main root, you cut the main stem, and plant it, and it would regenerate itself. So we dug up several hundred of those, and then located in Lesotho some village chiefs who were interested primarily in getting some vegetation in their areas, in their provinces, because at that time, land was not privately owned. The king was the principal chief of the country, and he owned all the land. And he delegated to village chiefs the use of certain areas of land. And some of those village chiefs were interested in getting more vegetation in their province, and some were not. But for those who were interested, we established small tree nurseries with this vegetation which could grow from cuttings. And after about 3 years, we were in Lesotho for 3 years, and after 3 years, we had about 200,000 seedlings ready for outplanting in 8 different tree nurseries. And the nurseries were managed all by local people because we had no money. And then another assignment we had was to establish a forestry school for Lesotho young men, Basuto boys, which we did. And we ran that into its second year and developed curricula and helped to teach and that sort of thing. And then the final objective was to establish a national forestry service in Lesotho, which we did, and had foresters assigned to different parts of the province, and had developed recruitment rules and operational rules and a service manual for all of these activities. And then after about 3 years, our time was up, and Phyllis and I decided our 3 girls were married or in college and on their own. So Phyllis and I flew to Luxembourg, and there we contacted a Volkswagen dealer and bought a Volkswagen camper. And we spent the next year meandering around Europe, mainly from beaches to ski areas. Finished?
No, keep on going. We got about 10 minutes.
To ski areas, and including ski areas in Italy, Austria, Switzerland. Let's see, we even had discovered ski areas in Pakistan, but they were not developed, but they had the snow in the higher elevations. And, but that was a wonderful time of the year and a wonderful time of our lives. And then eventually we had a chance to spend more time living in Rome, during which we taught our 3 daughters to ski on ski areas adjacent to Rome, and eventually decided it was time to move back to the States. And the girls were all interested in horse riding. So we found, with the help of a real estate agent from Clemens, we found 18 acres in Davie County, just south of Mocksville, about 6 miles south of Mocksville. And there I spent a year building a barn and building fences around all the pastures and clearing the pastures for improved grass. And then we bought 3 horses. And over the time, my 9 grandchildren, 3 daughters and wife and I all learned to horse ride. And we had a great time because some of our neighbors rode horses. And the country was relatively unfenced, so we had a heck of a large area in which to ride. And so far as I know, nobody ever objected to our riding on their lands. And finally, in 1981, I think it was, I went down to clean the stables one day, and we had been on the farm for about 5 or 6 years, and of course during that time the girls had grown older and gotten interested in other things. Anyway, this one morning I went down to clean the stables, and I looked around, discovered I was the only one there. And I thought, heck, this isn't what I want to do for the rest of my life. So we moved into Mocksville town and built a house, and that's where we are now.
Bob, I always find your story amazing because you were a kid from a small coal mining town, and you wound up seeing the world. You've been to about every place except the moon, I believe. But I want to tell you how much I appreciate, number one, your service to the country there at the end of World War II. Your service, your country called, and you went forward, and appreciate your willingness to share your story with us. And I appreciate our friendship. I have for many years, and I'll just continue to enjoy seeing you at Rotary as often as you can make it.
Well, you and your dad have been great friends to us, to me, and I really do appreciate the effort you're taking in meeting with veterans of World War II and getting their stories, because most of those stories are not in print.
That's right.
The library carries a lot of good books about World War II and subsequent wars, and I enjoy reading them. But that day where we had lunch at Dino's and heard a variety of stories, that was a novel experience, and I appreciate it.
It was.
So thanks a lot.
You bet. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Mocksville, thank you for tuning in and listening to another story from a World War II veteran. And as I have always ended these videos, God bless America.